The gleaming glass and steel of Reynolds Enterprise headquarters stretched towards the sky, casting long shadows over the bustling streets of downtown. Inside, while executives in $1,000 suits rushed between meetings, Rose quietly went about her work, pushing her cleaning cart through the pristine hallways during the early morning hours. At 42, Rose had spent the last 15 years working as a janitor, taking pride in keeping the building spotless even if few noticed her presence. Her dark hair, streaked with early gray, was always neatly tied back as she worked, her movements efficient and practiced. She had learned long ago to become almost invisible to the office workers, a skill that helped her avoid unwanted attention. That morning started like any other, with Rose arriving at 5 a.m. to begin her rounds. The building was mostly empty, save for the occasional ambitious employee hoping to impress the boss by being early. Rose preferred these quiet hours, when she could work in peace without dodging hurried feet or cleaning up fresh coffee spills. Everything changed when Alexander Reynolds III, the newly appointed CEO, arrived unexpectedly early. At 35, he had recently taken over from his father, and rumors of his harsh management style had already spread throughout the building. His expensive shoes clicked against the marble floor as he approached, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care about excuses," he barked into the phone, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "If they can't meet our demands, find someone who will." He ended the call abruptly, only to find his path partially blocked by Rose's cleaning cart. "Move this immediately," he commanded without looking at her, already typing on his phone. Rose quickly began to maneuver the cart aside, but in her haste, a bottle of cleaning solution tipped over, spilling onto the floor, and onto Alexander's Italian leather shoes. The silence that followed was deafening. "Do you have any idea how much these shoes cost?" Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. "More than you probably make in 3 months." Rose kept her eyes down, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for paper towels. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll clean it right away." "Sorry doesn't cut it," he continued, his voice rising. "This kind of incompetence is exactly what's wrong with this place. My father may have tolerated mediocrity, but I won't." As Rose knelt to clean the spill, Alexander pulled out his phone again. "Security, I want someone removed from the building. 4th floor, East Wing." He paused, looking down at Rose with cold eyes. "And make sure her replacement knows how to do their job properly." What happened next would have remained just another story of corporate cruelty, if not for the small gold locket that had slipped from Rose's uniform as she bent down. The antique piece caught Alexander's eye, not because of its value, but because of its familiar design. His words died in his throat as he stared at the locket. It was identical to the one in his father's old photographs, the one his father had given to his first wife before their divorce, the same wife who had taken their daughter and disappeared 30 years ago. Alexander's hand shook slightly as he pointed to the locket. "Where did you get that?" Rose clutched the locket protectively, years of ingrained caution making her hesitant to answer. But something in his expression made her pause. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "She gave it to me before she passed away 10 years ago." The color drained from Alexander's face as the implications hit him. His father's first marriage, the half-sister he'd never met, the timing, it all aligned with devastating clarity. The woman he'd just tried to fire, the woman he'd just humiliated, might be his long-lost stepsister. The security guards arrived at that moment, but they found an entirely different scene than they'd expected. Instead of an angry CEO demanding someone's removal, they found Alexander Reynolds III standing in stunned silence, staring at a janitor as if seeing a ghost. This moment marked the beginning of a story that would shake the foundations of Reynolds Enterprise, challenge everything Alexander thought he knew about family, and force both him and Rose to confront truths that had been buried for decades. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to change in ways they could never have imagined. For Rose, who had spent years working in the shadows of the wealthy, and Alexander, who had built walls around himself with privilege and power, this accidental meeting would spark a journey that would teach them both about humility, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. The following days at Reynolds Enterprise were filled with an uncomfortable tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the building. Rose continued her work, but now she felt eyes following her everywhere she went. Word had spread quickly about the strange encounter between the CEO and the janitor, though nobody knew the true story yet. Alexander had retreated to his office, canceling meetings and spending hours poring over old family photographs and documents. The locket had unlocked a flood of memories he'd tried to forget, fragments of conversations overheard as a child, hushed arguments between his father and stepmother, and the persistent question of what had happened to his father's first family. One quiet evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Alexander found himself walking the empty halls of his building. He knew Rose would be working, he'd memorized her schedule by now. He found her in the break room on the third floor, methodically wiping down tables. "My father never talked about his first wife," Alexander said softly, causing Rose to startle slightly. "I used to find old pictures sometimes, but whenever I asked questions, he'd change the subject." Rose set down her cleaning cloth, her movements careful and measured. "My mother didn't like talking about the past either," she replied. "She only told me that she left to protect me, that sometimes love isn't enough when two people come from different worlds." Alexander pulled out a chair and sat down, his usual corporate polish cracking slightly. "I've spent the last few days looking through everything I could find. Birth certificates, marriage records, old photos." He pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket. "I found this in my father's old study." Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age, showing a young woman holding a baby. She wore the same locket that now hung around Rose's neck. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Catherine and Rose, 1981. Rose's hands trembled as she took the photograph. "I've never seen this," she whispered. Mom didn't keep many photos from those days. She traced her mother's face in the picture, noting the happiness in her smile, so different from the tired expression she remembered from her childhood. "She worked here too, didn't she?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "As a secretary for my father." Rose nodded. "That's how they met. She told me it was like a fairy tale at first, the handsome businessman falling for his secretary. But fairy tales don't always survive in the real world." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your grandmother, our grandmother," she made it clear that someone from Mom's background would never be accepted in their social circle. Alexander felt shame burn in his chest. History had repeated itself in the worst way possible. He had treated Rose with the same condescension and cruelty that had driven her mother away years ago. "I've been trying to understand why my father never looked for you," he said. "After he died last year, I found letters he'd written but never sent. He wanted to reach out, but by then, your mother had changed her name, moved away. He convinced himself it was better to leave the past buried." Rose smoothed her uniform, a habit born of nervousness. "Mom worked 3 jobs sometimes, but she made sure I got an education. I went to night school, earned my degree in business administration." She gave a small, ironic laugh. "I could probably run an office like this, but life has a way of closing doors before you can reach them." Alexander sat back, really looking at Rose for the first time. He saw intelligence in her eyes, dignity in her bearing, and a strength that all his privilege and money couldn't buy. "Life also has a way of opening unexpected doors," he said quietly. The next morning, employees arriving at Reynolds Enterprise were surprised to see the CEO himself in the lobby, waiting for Rose's arrival. Even more surprising was what happened next. "I can't change the past," Alexander said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I can try to make things right now." He turned to face the growing crowd of employees. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Rose Mitchell. She's my stepsister, and starting today, she'll be joining our executive training program." The whispers started immediately. Rose stood frozen, her cleaning cart forgotten beside her. "I don't need charity," she said firmly. "It's not charity," Alexander replied. "It's an opportunity, one that should have been yours years ago. You'll still have to work for it, prove yourself just like anyone else. But this time, the door will be open." Tears threatened to spill from Rose's eyes, but she held them back. Years of maintaining her dignity in difficult situations had taught her that. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and nodded. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Alexander said, then added more quietly, "and I won't let you down either. Not this time." As Rose followed Alexander to his office to begin her new chapter, she touched the locket around her neck. Somewhere, she thought, her mother was smiling. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest challenges, and sometimes family can be found in the most unexpected places. The employees watched them go, witnessing the beginning of a transformation, not just of Rose's life, but of the entire company culture. Alexander Reynolds III, known for his cold corporate demeanor, had shown a different side of himself. And in doing so, he had begun to heal not only his family's past wounds but also the rigid class divisions that had long defined Reynolds' enterprise. The transition from cleaning floors to attending executive meetings wasn't as smooth as fairy tales might suggest. Rose's first week in the executive training program was a stark reminder that changing someone's position doesn't automatically change how others see them. She could feel the stares and hear the whispers as she walked through the halls she once cleaned, now dressed in a borrowed business suit that felt like a costume. The morning meeting was particularly challenging. Rose sat at the conference table, her notebook open and pen ready, trying to ignore the sideways glances from her new colleagues. The senior executives, people who had barely acknowledged her existence a week ago, now had to treat her as an equal, at least in theory. "Since we have a new addition to our team," said Patricia Wong, the chief financial officer, with barely concealed skepticism, "perhaps we should review the basics of our quarterly projections." Her tone made it clear she considered this a waste of time. Rose felt her face flush but kept her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more criticism. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I've already reviewed the quarterly reports. While cleaning the copy room last month, I noticed some interesting patterns in the discarded drafts." The room fell silent as Rose pulled out several carefully prepared notes. "There's a recurring inefficiency in our supply chain management that's costing us nearly $500,000 annually. I had plenty of time to analyze the numbers during my night shifts." Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, couldn't hide his smile. This was exactly why he'd given her this chance. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and they both knew it. Later that afternoon, Rose found herself in the employee break room, the same one she used to clean. As she waited for her coffee to brew, she overheard two employees talking around the corner. "It's ridiculous," one voice said. "We work here for years, climbing the corporate ladder, and she just gets handed a golden ticket because of some convenient family connection." "I heard she planned it all," another voice added. "Found out about the family connection and orchestrated that whole scene with the CEO. Pretty clever, really." Rose's hand tightened around her coffee cup, but before she could move, another voice joined the conversation. "You know what's really clever?" It was Alexander, his voice carrying that quiet authority that immediately silenced the room. "Working full-time as a janitor while putting yourself through night school to earn a business degree. Or spotting a major cost-saving opportunity in discarded reports while everyone else overlooked it. That kind of clever?" The break room quickly emptied, leaving Rose and Alexander alone. "You don't have to fight my battles," she said softly. "No, but I want to," he replied, then sighed. "Though I suppose I'm partly to blame for how they're treating you. My reputation for being cold and demanding didn't help create a welcoming environment." Rose managed a small smile. Well, we both have some adjusting to do. She looked down at her business attire. Though I have to admit, I miss my comfortable work shoes. These heels are killing me. Alexander chuckled, then turned serious. I found more letters, he said. From your mother to our father. She wrote to him several times over the years, keeping him updated about you. Your graduation, your struggle to find work during the recession. He kept every letter. Rose felt tears threatening again. But he never responded. He wrote replies, dozens of them. But he never sent them. I found them all in his personal safe. Alexander pulled out an old envelope. This one's from when you first started working here. He recognized you from your employee ID photo, but he was too much of a coward to face the past. Rose took the letter with trembling hands but didn't open it. Some wounds needed time to heal, and some truths needed to be absorbed slowly. The next few weeks brought more challenges and small victories. Rose's background as a janitor, which some tried to use against her, proved to be her greatest strength. She knew every inch of the building, understood the day-to-day operations from the ground up, and had insights into employee behavior that others missed. One evening, as Rose was leaving the office, now at a reasonable hour instead of her old pre-dawn schedule, she found Alexander waiting by her car. There's something I need to show you, he said, holding up a set of keys. It's about time you saw the other side of your heritage. They drove through the city's expensive residential district, finally stopping at a massive iron gate. Beyond it stood the Reynolds family mansion, where their father had lived and where Alexander had grown up. This is part of your history too, Alexander said as they walked through the grand entrance. Even if it was denied to you before. Rose walked through the halls, taking in the family portraits, the antique furniture, the weight of generations of wealth and privilege. In the library, Alexander pulled out a dusty photo album. Look, he said, pointing to a picture of a much younger version of their father. He was smiling, holding hands with a beautiful young woman wearing a familiar locket. This was their wedding day. Before society and family expectations tore them apart. Rose touched the photo gently. They looked happy. They were, Alexander confirmed. And I think that's why he could never truly move on. My mother, his second wife, she always knew she was second choice. It made her bitter, made her push me to be harder, colder, more focused on success than happiness. Rose looked at her stepbrother, understanding dawning in her eyes. We both paid for their choices, didn't we? Just in different ways. Alexander nodded. But we can choose differently. We can be the generation that breaks the cycle. As they left the mansion that night, Rose felt something shift inside her. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was unwritten. She and Alexander were living proof that it's never too late to right old wrongs and bridge divides that once seemed impossible to cross. 3 months into her new role, Rose had begun to find her footing in the corporate world of Reynolds Enterprise. Her old cleaning cart had been replaced by a laptop bag, and her quiet observations had transformed into confident presentations. But it was her unique perspective that truly set her apart from her colleagues. During a crucial board meeting about employee satisfaction and retention rates, Rose's past experience proved invaluable. While other executives suggested expensive consultants and complex programs, she offered insights that only someone who had worked at every level could provide. Our maintenance and support staff turnover rate is 40% higher than industry standard, Rose explained, standing at the front of the boardroom. Not because of the pay, but because of how they're treated. When I worked as a janitor, I saw talented people leave because they felt invisible, disrespected. She clicked to the next slide of her presentation. I propose a comprehensive reform of our corporate culture, starting from the ground up. Cross-departmental mentorship programs, clear advancement paths for all employees, and mandatory sensitivity training for management. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Alexander leaned forward, intrigued. He'd noticed how the company atmosphere had already begun to change since Rose's promotion. The rigid hierarchy was slowly dissolving, replaced by something more collaborative and human. After the meeting, Alexander found Rose in their father's old office, now hers. She was standing by the window, holding a framed photograph she'd found in one of the drawers. It showed their father at a company picnic 20 years ago. In the background, barely visible, was a younger Rose and her mother, serving food to the executives. "I remember that day," Rose said without turning around. "Mom had taken an extra catering job to help pay for my school books. She knew he would be there, but she still took the job. She said we couldn't let fear of the past stop us from moving forward." Alexander moved to stand beside her. "I was there too," he admitted. "I saw you both, but I was too wrapped up in my own world to really see you. Father looked at you for a long time that day. Now I understand why he seemed so distant afterward." Rose placed the photo on her desk, next to her business degree in a small plant, signs of her new life taking root. "I've been reading his letters," she said quietly. "The ones he never sent. He watched me grow up from a distance, too afraid to reach out, too proud to admit his mistakes. In one letter, he wrote about seeing me at my college graduation. He sat in the back, just to hear them call my name." Alexander ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that revealed the stress beneath his polished exterior. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," he said. "Not just the companies, but our families. We inherited more than just this business, we inherited all the choices, good and bad, that came before us." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Patricia Wong, the CFO who had initially been skeptical of Rose, entered with a stack of reports. "Your proposal from the board meeting," she said, placing them on Rose's desk. "I've run the numbers. It's actually quite impressive. The potential long-term savings from reduced turnover alone could fund the entire program." Rose thanked her, noting the newfound respect in Patricia's tone. It had taken time, but her colleagues were beginning to see her value beyond her family connection. Later that evening, as the office emptied, Rose received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chen, one of the night shift cleaners, appeared at her door. It was strange seeing her former colleague in this context, a reminder of how much had changed. "We miss you downstairs," Mrs. Chen said with a warm smile. "But we're all so proud. You give us hope that hard work really can change things." Rose felt tears welling up. "I haven't forgotten where I came from," she assured her old friend. "And I never will." That night, Alexander invited Rose to dinner, not at an expensive restaurant as he might have done before, but at a small diner where she and her mother used to eat when money was tight. As they sat in the worn vinyl booth, the gap between their past lives seemed both vast and insignificant. "I found something else in Father's papers," Alexander said, pulling out an old legal document. Before he died, he had started the process of changing his will. He wanted to make things right, to acknowledge you officially. He ran out of time, but his intentions were clear. Rose stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "You know, for years I was angry at him, at the unfairness of it all. But now, sitting here with you, I realize that maybe things happened exactly as they needed to. If he had acknowledged me back then, would I be the same person? Would you?" Alexander considered this. The arrogant CEO who had berated a janitor over spilled cleaning solution seemed like a different person now. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can learn from it. Every day, I see you turn what could have been bitterness into compassion, and it makes me want to be better." As they left the diner, they noticed a group of cleaning staff heading to their night shift at a nearby office building. Rose and Alexander shared a look of understanding. Tomorrow, they would continue their work of transforming Reynolds Enterprise into a place where everyone's dignity and potential were recognized. The locket around Rose's neck caught the streetlight, reminding them both of how their story began. But now it wasn't just a symbol of past secrets and separation, it had become a bridge between two worlds, a reminder that true family bonds can transcend social barriers and heal even the deepest wounds. 6 months into Rose's new position at Reynolds Enterprise, an unexpected visitor arrived who would test the growing bond between the step-siblings. Eleanor Reynolds, Alexander's mother and their father's second wife, swept into the office lobby one morning, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with purpose. Rose was in the middle of a presentation to the department heads when her assistant quietly interrupted with the news. The color drained from her face. She had heard enough stories about Eleanor Reynolds to know this wouldn't be a pleasant encounter. Alexander met his mother at the elevator, his expression tense. "Mother, this is unexpected. You usually call before flying in from Palm Beach." Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand waved dismissively. "When I hear my son is destroying everything his father built, I don't wait for an invitation." Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the office. "The board members have been calling me. Telling me about all the changes you're making." Before Alexander could respond, Rose emerged from the conference room. Eleanor's gaze locked onto her, then dropped to the locket around her neck. For a moment, something flickered across her face, recognition, perhaps even fear. "So," Eleanor said coldly, "this is her. The cleaning woman who claims to be Richard's daughter." She turned to Alexander. "Darling, surely you see what's happening here? She's manipulating you, using some old piece of jewelry to con her way into the family fortune." Alexander stepped forward, but Rose spoke first, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mrs. Reynolds, I understand your concern. But I'm not here to claim anything. Everything I have, I've earned through hard work, first as a janitor, and now as an executive in training." Eleanor laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "An executive? Is that what we're calling it? I suppose it's easier than admitting my son is being taken advantage of by some woman's guilty conscience." "That's enough, Mother," Alexander's voice cut through the tension. "Rose isn't just father's daughter, she's proven herself more than capable in her role here. Our employee satisfaction is up 60%, turnover is down, and our latest quarter showed the best profits in company history." Eleanor's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly. "You sound just like your father when he first met her mother. So convinced he'd found something special in someone so common." She pulled a folder from her designer bag. "I came prepared for this. These papers will require a DNA test before she can claim any connection to the Reynolds name." Rose felt her chest tighten, but she maintained her dignity. "With all due respect, Mrs. Reynolds, I don't need a DNA test to prove my worth. My work speaks for itself. And I'm not interested in the Reynolds name or fortune. I already have a name I'm proud of, my mother's name." Eleanor wasn't finished. "I watched Richard destroy himself with guilt over abandoning you and your mother. His precious first family that he gave up to maintain the Reynolds legacy. It nearly ruined our marriage, his obsession with making things right." She turned to Alexander. "And now you're letting that guilt infect you too." "No, Mother," Alexander said quietly. "What nearly ruined this family wasn't Rose or her mother, it was the idea that status and appearance matter more than human dignity. Father realized that too late, but I won't make the same mistake." Rose noticed other employees gathering at the edges of the scene, watching with concern. Among them was Mrs. Chen, now a department supervisor thanks to Rose's new corporate ladder program. The older woman gave her an encouraging nod. "Mrs. Reynolds," Rose said, stepping closer to the elegant woman who had once been her father's wife, "I spent years cleaning offices late at night so I could put myself through business school. I've learned that true class has nothing to do with designer labels or trust funds, it's about how you treat people, especially those society says are beneath you." Eleanor's perfectly lined lips trembled slightly. "You sound just like her. Like Catherine." For the first time, her voice held something other than contempt, perhaps a hint of old pain. She made Richard question everything about our world. And now you're here, doing the same thing. Alexander placed a gentle hand on his mother's arm. Maybe it's time we all questioned it, Mother. Look around, the company is thriving because we're finally recognizing the value in all our employees, not just those born into privilege. Rose unclasped the locket from her neck and held it out to Eleanor. Would you like to see inside? There's a picture of them on their wedding day. He's smiling in a way that I've only seen in this photo. Eleanor stared at the locket for a long moment, then slowly reached out to open it. As she looked at the young, happy faces captured inside, something in her expression softened. He never smiled like that again, she whispered. Not even with me. The three of them stood in silence, surrounded by the hushed whispers of employees trying to pretend they weren't watching. In that moment, the carefully maintained walls of class and privilege that had defined Reynolds Enterprise for generations seemed to crack just a little more. Finally, Eleanor closed the locket and handed it back to Rose. The board members are wrong, she said, her voice quieter now. The changes you're making, they're what Richard wanted to do, in the end. He was just too afraid of becoming the man who chose love over duty twice in one lifetime. As Eleanor turned to leave, she paused. Keep the DNA test papers. Do with them what you want. But know this, you have more of Richard in you than just his blood. You have his heart, the one he lost somewhere between duty and regret. After Eleanor's departure, Rose and Alexander found themselves back in their father's old office, both emotionally drained but somehow lighter. Rose picked up the photo of the company picnic, looking at it with new eyes. You know, she said, maybe the real inheritance isn't the company or the Reynolds name. Maybe it's the chance to right old wrongs and build something better. Alexander smiled, thinking of how far they'd come from that first confrontation over spilled cleaning solution. I think Father would be proud of that legacy. Outside the office windows, the sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows through the gleaming glass towers. But inside Reynolds Enterprise, old shadows were finally beginning to fade, making way for a new kind of light. The aftermath of Eleanor's visit rippled through Reynolds Enterprise like waves in a still pond. Rose found herself at the center of even more attention, but this time it was different. Employees who had previously kept their distance now approached her with their own stories of family struggles, of dreams deferred, of barriers overcome. One rainy morning, as Rose sorted through her emails, she discovered something unexpected, a message from Eleanor with an attachment. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a scanned photo album, filled with pictures she'd never seen before. Images of her father in his younger days, including several of him with her mother, Catherine. I found these in the attic of the Palm Beach house, Eleanor's message read. I've held on to them for years, telling myself I was protecting the family legacy. Now I realize I was just holding on to old hurts. They belong to you. As Rose scrolled through the photos, Alexander knocked on her office door. Ready for the charity gala planning meeting? He asked, then noticed her tears. What's wrong? Rose turned her computer screen to show him. Your mother, she sent these. She paused on a particular photo, their father teaching a young Alexander to ride a bike. In the background, barely noticeable, was a park bench where a woman and small girl sat watching. That's me and Mom. We used to go to that park every Sunday. She never told me why. Alexander sat heavily in the chair across from her desk. I remember that day. I fell off the bike at least a dozen times. Father kept encouraging me to try again. He leaned closer to the screen. He must have known you were there. Both of you. Maybe that's why he chose that park, Rose said softly. A way to keep us all together, even if we couldn't really be together. Their contemplation was interrupted by Patricia Wong bursting into the office. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. The Simpson contract, there are some irregularities in the numbers. The audit team just flagged it. The Simpson contract was one of the company's oldest and most profitable partnerships. Rose had actually noticed something odd about their billing patterns during her cleaning days, but back then, who would have listened to a janitor's concerns? "Show me everything," Rose said, switching immediately into business mode. She and Alexander spent the next several hours poring over financial records, with Rose's unique perspective proving invaluable once again. "See this pattern?" she pointed out. "When I cleaned the accounting department, I used to see similar discrepancies in the recycling bin. I always wondered why they printed so many revised versions of the same reports." Alexander's face darkened as the truth became clear. Someone in their company had been helping the Simpsons systematically overcharge for services, probably in exchange for kickbacks. The scheme had been going on for years, hidden in plain sight. "We need to handle this carefully," Alexander said. "The Simpsons have been family friends for generations. This could get ugly." Rose straightened in her chair. "Then let's make sure we do it right. No covering up, no special treatment. That's the old Reynolds Enterprise way. We're better than that now." They worked late into the night, preparing documents and building their case. Around midnight, Rose found herself back in the break room where she'd spent countless nights during her cleaning shifts. The familiar hum of the vending machine was oddly comforting. "Couldn't sleep either?" Alexander appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Rose replied. "A year ago, I was cleaning this room. Now I'm helping expose corporate fraud." Alexander smiled tiredly. "You know, Father used to say that the measure of a person isn't in their successes, but in how they handle their challenges." He paused. "I never really understood what he meant until I met you." The next day, they called an emergency board meeting. The room was tense as Rose presented their findings. Some of the older board members, who had known the Simpson family for decades, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This isn't just about money," Rose concluded her presentation. "It's about trust. Trust from our employees, our clients, and the public. We can't build a better company on a foundation of deception." One of the board members, an elderly man who had served since their father's time, spoke up. "Your father, he suspected something like this years ago. But the Simpsons had too much influence, too many connections. He chose to look the other way." "Well, we're not looking away anymore," Alexander stated firmly. "Rose is right. It's time for Reynolds Enterprise to stand for something more than just profit." As they left the boardroom, victorious but drained, Rose's phone buzzed with another message from Eleanor. This one contained a video file, old home movie footage from a Reynolds family Christmas party. In one scene, the camera had accidentally captured a glimpse of the catering staff, including Catherine. "I remember that night," Eleanor's message read. "She looked at him with such love, even then. And he never stopped looking for her in every room he entered. I spent years being angry about that, but now I understand. Love doesn't always fit into the boxes we try to put it in." That evening, Rose and Alexander sat in their father's old office, watching the grainy footage together. Through the lens of time, they could see all the missed connections, the almost moments, the parallel lives that had finally, unexpectedly converged. "We're not just fixing the company," Rose said, touching her mother's locket. "We're healing the family. All of it." Alexander nodded, understanding that the Simpson scandal was just another test of their new values. The old Reynolds Enterprise was built on appearances and influence. The new one will be built on integrity and inclusion. As night fell over the city, the siblings continued their work, knowing that each challenge they faced together made their unusual bond stronger. The corporate world might not have been ready for their story, but they were ready to tell it, one changed life at a time. The morning after exposing the Simpson scandal, Rose arrived at work to find the media camped outside Reynolds Enterprise. The story had leaked, and now reporters were eager to uncover not just the fraud, but the unlikely story of the janitor-turned-executive who helped expose it. "Miss Mitchell. Is it true you were working as a cleaner when you discovered the fraud?" a reporter called out as Rose made her way through the crowd. "Ms. Mitchell, can you comment on rumors that you're Richard Reynolds' illegitimate daughter?" Rose kept walking, her mother's words echoing in her mind, "Hold your head high, no matter what they say about you." Inside the lobby, she found Alexander already dealing with a crisis management team. "The Simpsons are threatening to go public with old company secrets," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They're claiming father was involved in questionable deals decades ago." Rose felt her stomach tighten. "They're trying to tarnish his legacy to distract from their own fraud." "It gets worse," Alexander continued. "They've somehow gotten hold of mother's old emails, messages about your mother, about father's attempts to track you both down. They're threatening to turn this into a scandal about the Reynolds family rather than their own corruption." Before they could discuss further, Patricia Wong rushed in. "You both need to see this. The Simpson family just went on morning television." On the office television, James Simpson Jr., heir to the Simpson fortune, was speaking with practiced sympathy. "It's truly unfortunate that the Reynolds siblings are airing old grievances through false accusations. Perhaps if Richard Reynolds had spent more time managing his company instead of searching for his abandoned family, none of this would have happened." Rose felt her blood boil, but years of maintaining composure in difficult situations helped her stay calm. "They're trying to make this personal because they can't defend themselves professionally." Alexander's phone buzzed, another message from Eleanor. To everyone's surprise, she was already on a flight back from Palm Beach. "Mother says she's not running from this fight," he read aloud. "She's bringing father's private records." Throughout the day, more revelations emerged. Old photos of company parties showed the clear social divide, executives in fine clothes while service staff like Rose's mother worked in the background. The media seized on the symbolism, but not in the way the Simpsons had hoped. Instead of a scandal, the public saw a story of redemption. Social media filled with posts from people sharing their own experiences of workplace discrimination and class barriers. #Reynolds Reform started trending as former employees came forward with stories about how the company's recent changes had improved their lives. Late that afternoon, Eleanor arrived, carrying a worn leather briefcase. "Your father kept everything," she said, placing it on Rose's desk. "Every receipt, every memo, every piece of evidence of the Simpsons' fraudulent billing. He was building a case, but he was afraid exposing them would lead them to reveal his past, to reveal you, Rose." Rose opened the briefcase with trembling hands. Inside were meticulously organized documents spanning decades. Their father had been watching, recording, protecting in his own way, even if he couldn't bring himself to act. "There's something else," Eleanor added, pulling out an old letter. "He wrote this the day before he died. It was supposed to be read at the next board meeting, but I hid it. I was trying to protect what I thought was important. I was wrong." The letter revealed everything, the truth about Catherine, about Rose, about the systemic problems in the company culture. Richard Reynolds had planned to clean house, to make amends, to bring his daughter home. He'd run out of time, but he'd left the tools for his children to finish what he'd started. As evening approached, Rose and Alexander called an emergency press conference. Standing at the podium together, they presented not just evidence of the Simpsons' fraud, but a vision for corporate reform that went beyond their own company. Reynolds Enterprise was built on the hard work of people at every level, Rose spoke clearly into the microphones. From the executives in the boardroom to the cleaning staff working through the night. "It's time we acknowledged that success isn't just about profit margins, it's about creating a workplace where everyone has the chance to rise based on their merit, not their background." Alexander stepped forward. My sister's journey from janitor to executive isn't just a heartwarming story, it's a wake-up call. How much talent are we wasting by maintaining artificial barriers? How many brilliant minds are we ignoring because they don't fit our preconceptions of success? The press conference ended with an unexpected moment. Eleanor approached the podium, elegant as ever, but with tears in her eyes. I spent years trying to maintain what I thought was the Reynolds legacy, she said. But these two have shown me what that legacy should truly be. Richard would be proud, not just of their business acumen, but of their courage to break down the walls he himself helped build. That night, after the reporters had gone and the office had quieted, Rose found herself back in the janitor's break room. Mrs. Chen was there, having just finished her supervisor rounds. "Your mother would be proud," Mrs. Chen said softly. "She always said you were meant for more than just cleaning up after others." Rose touched the locket around her neck. "I learned my most important lessons with a mop in my hand," she replied. "About dignity, about perseverance, about seeing what others miss." She looked around the room, at the worn couch where she'd studied for her business degree during breaks, at the coffee machine that had kept her going through long nights, at the bulletin board where she'd once posted cleaning schedules and now displayed employee advancement opportunities. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his tie loose and jacket discarded. "The board just called. The Simpsons are backing down. They're offering a full confession in exchange for leniency." Rose nodded, unsurprised. They never understood that true strength isn't in keeping secrets, it's in having the courage to face them. As they stood there, in the humble break room where their story had begun, both siblings understood that they'd done more than just save their company from scandal. They'd started a conversation about class, opportunity, and the true meaning of family that would ripple far beyond the walls of Reynolds Enterprise. 1 year after the Simpson scandal, Reynolds Enterprise had transformed into something their father could never have imagined. The company's revolutionary employee advancement program had become a model for corporate reform nationwide, and Rose's story had inspired similar changes across the industry. On a crisp autumn morning, Rose stood in front of the building's main entrance, watching as workers installed a new sign. Below the Reynolds Enterprise logo, golden letters spelled out, "Building success together, every voice matters." It had been Mrs. Chen's suggestion, voted on by employees at all levels of the company. "Quite a change from the old excellence through tradition motto," Alexander said, joining her on the sidewalk. They both remembered the old sign. Rose had cleaned it countless times during her years as a janitor. "Speaking of change," Rose replied, checking her watch, "we should head up. The documentary crew will be here soon." A major business network was filming a special about their story, not just about the scandal and its resolution, but about the deeper transformation of both the company and the family. As they walked through the lobby, employees greeted them warmly. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined Reynolds Enterprise had given way to something more human. In the executive conference room, Eleanor was already waiting, looking through old photographs they'd gathered for the documentary. "I found this in the Palm Beach house," she said, holding up a faded envelope. "It's the guest list from your parents' wedding. Look who was invited." Rose took the list, her eyes widening. Nearly every name had been crossed out, all the wealthy friends and business associates who had declined to attend when they learned Richard Reynolds was marrying his secretary. "He chose love over status," Eleanor said softly. "I spent years resenting that choice, never understanding that it was his finest moment, until now." The documentary interview began with the three of them sharing their perspectives on the past year's events. But it quickly became clear that this was more than just another corporate success story. The real fraud, Rose explained to the interviewer, wasn't just in the accounting. It was in believing that worth could be measured by background or status. "Every night, while cleaning these offices, I saw talented people being overlooked simply because they didn't fit someone's idea of what success should look like." Alexander picked up the thread. When Rose first revealed her identity, I thought it was about making amends for our father's choices. But it became something much bigger, a chance to question everything we thought we knew about merit, opportunity, and family. Eleanor's segment was perhaps the most surprising. I was the villain in this story, she admitted with remarkable candor. The society wife who helped push another woman out because she didn't fit our world. But Rose and Alexander showed me that our world needed to change. During a break in filming, Rose received an unexpected call. The director of a major charitable foundation had seen their story and wanted to create a scholarship program, the Catherine Mitchell Scholarship for Working Parents, named after Rose's mother. Mom would have loved that, Rose said, wiping away tears. She always said education was the key to opening doors. The afternoon brought another surprise. Mrs. Chen led a group of employees into the conference room, carrying a large wrapped package. Inside was a beautifully framed collection of photographs, dozens of Reynolds Enterprise employees with their families, their diplomas, their success stories. You changed more than just the company, Mrs. Chen said. You changed lives. These are just some of the people who've been promoted, who've earned degrees, who've broken through barriers because of the changes you both made. As the day drew to a close, Rose, Alexander, and Eleanor found themselves in Richard Reynolds' old office, now a shared space where employees could meet and collaborate. The old oil paintings of stern-faced executives had been replaced by a wall of employee achievements and community involvement. I've been thinking, Alexander said, about expanding the program nationwide. Other companies have been asking how they can implement similar changes. Rose smiled, remembering her first days in the executive training program. We could create a consulting division, help other businesses transform their corporate culture. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it works. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Your father would be amazed. He spent years trapped between two worlds, never finding the courage to bring them together. But you too, you've created something entirely new. As the setting sun cast long shadows through the office windows, Rose took off her mother's locket and opened it one last time. The old wedding photo inside had been joined by a new one, Rose and Alexander at the company's first all-employee celebration, both laughing as they served food alongside the catering staff. You know what's funny? Rose said, looking at the photos. We spent so much time talking about healing the past, but what we really did was build a better future. Alexander put an arm around his sister's shoulders. That's the thing about family, real family. It's not about where you come from. It's about where you choose to go together. Eleanor touched the locket gently. Catherine would be proud too. She knew the power of choosing love over convention, of believing in possibility even when the world says no. As they left the office that evening, they passed the night cleaning crew arriving for their shift. Each worker wore a company badge that read Team Member. No more distinctions between staff levels, no more invisible workers in the shadows. Rose paused to chat with them, just as she did every evening. She knew their names, their stories, their dreams. This wasn't just corporate policy, it was personal. Every person who walked through the doors of Reynolds Enterprise was part of the story now, part of the change. The old locket still hung around Rose's neck, but it was no longer a symbol of secrets and separation. Instead, it had become a reminder that the most powerful changes often start with the smallest acts of recognition, seeing the worth in every person, believing in the possibility of transformation, and having the courage to bridge the gaps that divide us. As the city lights began to twinkle on, Rose, Alexander, and Eleanor walked out together, three people who had started as adversaries and become family, proving that sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones we choose to forge, and the greatest legacies are the ones that break down walls instead of building them.